All right, practicing midpoint finding endpoint. So using the formula to work backwards. This is number 21. What I would suggest doing is I have this set up because this is the stuff that you need to have set up. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to explain the parts and where they go and go through the same process for all 6 problems. So if you want to pause it and then go through all of this for each problem, do it. If you want to work the problem with me, do it. Whatever benefits you the most. So I labeled the endpoint as E and the midpoint as M. So that means that if we were to look on a graph, we have currently that much, and we're looking for this one right here. It means we don't know. We know how far half the line is. Now we have to find out where the other dot is on the other half. So this is your midpoint formula. I'm going to keep on highlighting that. This is your midpoint formula. Every time that we look at that, I'm going to ask you, what does this find? And every single time you're going to say, midpoint. Yes, I gave you a moment to say that out loud, and you should be saying it. Not in your head, you should be saying it out loud. You should go, midpoint. So whenever you have your x values divided by 2 and you have your y values divided by 2, it finds an average of the distance. So that's how we're able to move it over to the other half. We know half of it, and let's move it over to the other half. Now, whenever we're solving it backwards and we're looking for an endpoint, that means that we were actually given the answer. So whenever we use a midpoint formula, this thing is the answer. 814 is what we should be looking for. But not anymore, because they gave it to us, and we're going to use that next to the equal signs. So that's our answer. That's why I have x1 right here and y1 right here. I don't know what those are. So that means we're going to have to set up an equation and then solve it using reverse PEMDAS. So endpoint, -9, this is the x value. So I'm going to put -9. And then this is our y value, -1. Now, what does it equal? Well, whenever we solved the midpoint, this was the answer we got. X was 18 and y was 4. X was 8 and y was 14. So I'm going to bring this 8 down with our x values. That's what we said it equaled. And then I'm going to bring this y value down here. Now, this is where the process is the same every single time. So there's nothing we can do on top. So order of operations would say do parentheses, simplify fractions on top, then on bottom. There's nothing we can do on top. So we have to simplify by dividing by 2 and doing its opposite to both sides of the equation. So what I do to one side, I do to the other. If I cut something in half and then multiply the half by 2, it becomes 1. So this will be canceled out. It's no longer being cut in half. It's now just 1. X plus -9 equals 16. This turned into a one-step equation. This is going to turn into a one-step equation every single time. So when it says plus -9, we can do minus -9, and then minus -9. Whenever we have the double negative, you know it's a positive. So really, what we're doing is x equals 16 plus 9, which should be 25. So now we have an x value of 25. Going over to do the same exact thing over on the y values. Times 2, times 2. So this is going to go away, because whenever we cut something in half, then we multiply those halves by 2, it becomes 1. A half plus a half equals 1. And then 14 times 2 is 28. So same thing over here, minus a -1, we're doing the opposite operation. Because if we added a -1, we got to take away a -1. So anytime we say double negative, it goes to positive. Awesome. Y equals 28 plus 1 is 29. So really, our x and y values should be 25, 29. If you wanted to check that, you know that you have the other endpoint as 25, 29. So that means we have an x1 and x2. So I'll label those x1, x2. And we have a y1 and y2, y1 and y2. you should be able to set this up, add those up, divide it by 2, and get 814. If for some reason you're not, then it's a good thing we have all of this work shown right here. We can go back and look at it again. Instead of redoing the entire problem, we can just analyze where we made a mistake. So let's go ahead and check it. This is going to be the only one that I'm going to check, and then I'd prefer that you go through and check all the other ones. So let's do -9 plus 25 divided by 2, and then y1, which was -1, plus y2, which we said was 29, divided by 2. Okay, so let's take a little look. Bust out your calculator and do -9 plus 25, give you 16, divided by 2, and that'll give you 8. Look, just like you said the midpoint should. Then let's do -1 plus 29, give you 28, divided by 2 equals 14. Holy moly. Look at that. So whenever we use the midpoint formula, what you've told me every single time is that it finds the midpoint. Whenever we substitute our answer back in of 2529 of our other endpoint, it actually gave us the answer for the midpoint. That's called checking your work. Let's go to the next one. All right. So you're writing down, you're making an attempt. I'm going to go through and solve the problem, and then you can check it. If I'm wrong, then let's go over it the next time that we meet, and then we can problem solve as to what I did wrong. It helps to notice when something goes wrong, so we can troubleshoot and go through, okay, here's what happened, here's why it happened, instead of pretty much like at the end of tutoring when you said, okay, well, what did I do wrong? That's how we learn. All right. So x1, I have no idea. Just keep in mind, this is your midpoint formula, and this is what it equals. Okay. Now we got to work backwards. We're going to use this as what it equals, like you said. So that's why it's going to go next to the equal sign. So our x1 or x2, whatever your x value, your y value, 10 and 12. And the x value is supposed to equal 6, and the y value is supposed to equal 9. So the same process again. Multiply both sides by 2. That makes this go away. Whenever you cut something in half and then add it back together, 2 of them, you get 1. So that's a one-step equation. X plus 10 equals 12. I'm going to go ahead and go over and repeat that process for the y values. Times 2 times 2. Whenever you cut something in half and then you multiply a half by 2, it becomes 1. Y plus 12 equals 18. All right. Now solving one-step equations. You see that you're adding 10, and we know to do the opposite to work backwards. How did it add 10, and what was added to 10 to get to 12? Let's find out. That goes to 0. We're left with just x equals 2. Cool, and we know that that's right because 2 plus 10 equals 12. Check. Okay, so there is our x2. We're adding 12, and we know to do the opposite. That goes to nothing. We're left with just y. And since we took 12 away from here, we took 12 away from over here, and that left with a 6. 6 plus 12 equals 18. Check. So there's your y2. I want you to go ahead and use this x2 and y2 to substitute back into the midpoint formula with the other endpoint of 10, 12. So 10 plus 2 divided by 2, and then 12 plus 6 divided by 2. See if you end up getting 6, 9. Check it. All right. Given an endpoint and midpoint, it's always good to look at the problem and determine what you're given before you start trying to work with any of the stuff that you have. So think of it as like you know all the structure and the pieces, so why not look at what pieces you've been given before you try and build something? So this is going to be our x, this is y. Notice how I'm labeling this stuff. I would do this if I were taking a test. I would do this if I was in the classroom, if I were a student still. So the x value is going to be -8, y value -10. And we know that the midpoint formula, what you've told me every single time, it equals the midpoint. Whenever we have all this information, we solve it, it gives you the midpoint. That's what our answer is supposed to be. That's why our x value is going to be equal to 10, and our y value is going to be equal to -7. So, same exact process, nothing's changed. Times 2 to both sides. Whenever you cut something in half, and then you multiply a half by 2, it becomes 1. X plus -8 equals 20. All right, this is saying something plus -8 equals 20. I don't know yet. So we're dividing by 2 times 2. This times 2 thing is going to be there every single time, except for when you're actually solving the midpoint formula to get the midpoint. Right now we're looking for an endpoint. That's why it's all wonky. Whenever you divide something by 2, it gives you 2 halves. 2 halves make 1. Y plus -10 equals -14. So now we're going to solve a one-step equation. This says plus -8. So if I want to do the opposite of that, I would subtract a -8 from both sides. We know that double negatives make a positive. Cool. That means that goes to 0. We're left with x equals 28. So we should have an x value of 28. You can label this x2, and you can label this one x1. It doesn't matter. Because whenever you add them up and divide by 2, it makes no difference. 28 plus -8 or -8 plus 28 is still the same answer. You have plus -10 over here, so I'm going to do minus -10. Just to keep equations balanced, you have to do it both sides. We know that double negatives make a double positive. Okay, so cool. So then we added -10, so that means I added a positive 10 to zero it out. Working it backwards. Then -14 plus 10 is -4. This is could be your y2. So currently what we have is 28, -4 is our answer. I want you to plug it back into the original formula and see if it ends up equaling 10, -7. Because that's what you said whenever you have an endpoint and an endpoint, that when you plug those numbers into the formula, it should give you the midpoint. Here is the answer. Solve it forward and see if it makes sense. All right, given an endpoint and a midpoint, that means we only have one x value and one y value to plug in. Here is x and here is y. This is what you say is the answer, which is why we put it over by the equal sign. What the midpoint formula equals is the midpoint. So -11, 9, and we know that the x value is supposed to equal 3, and the y value is supposed to equal -11. Now we go through the same routine, times 2. We times 2 every time, because it's being divided by 2, so we have to do it to both sides. Whenever you cut something in half, you have a half and a half. Times 2 would give you 1 whole. X plus -11 equals 6. Whenever you cut something in half, and then you multiply a half by 2, it becomes 1. Y plus 9 equals -22. Now, we have a one-step equation. This is adding -11, so I'm going to subtract -11 from both sides. We know that whenever we see a double positive or a double negative, we slash and dash that thing. That goes to 0. We're left with x equals 17. You can label that x2 if you want. Okay, this is going to be the x value for the other endpoint. We see plus 9. We know we have to work backwards, so -9. 9 was added on to y to get -22. For us to work backwards, you need to remove it. -22 plus -9. I'm going to go ahead and just play it safe. -22 plus -9 is -31. I just wanted to make sure. There's no reason why not to look. All right, so y2. So what this is telling us is that we should have a x value of 17 and a y value of -31. That sounds heavy, probably because it is. Okay, I want you to plug the x and y back into the midpoint formula, check it, and it should equal 3, negative 11. If you're sitting there going like, whoa, hold on, and get this part done, and if we're making mistakes, we can analyze it. All right, so you're given an endpoint and a midpoint. We know that this is supposed to be the answer, but since we're working backwards, we're missing parts. We have to find the other end. All right, so I'm just going to put an E down here because that's where our end is going to be. We know an x value is negative 2 and a y value is 7. So that's what we can plug in. Negative 2 and 7. We know that the midpoint formula is supposed to equal the midpoint. So that's why the x value is supposed to equal 12 and the y value is supposed to equal 10. The same routine as always. Multiply by 2 on both sides. So yeah, you're solving two-step equations. Okay, and boom, boom. All right, so whenever you cut something in half and then you multiply it by 2, a half times 2 is equal to 1. X plus negative 2 equals 24. So whenever this whole thing right here was cut in half, that's why you had the divided by 2, and that's why the 24 was half as much. So whenever you cut something in half, and then you multiply by 2, you end up getting 1 whole. Y plus 7 equals negative 20. This is where we start doing the opposite of what we see in the problem because we're still working backwards. We see plus negative 2 minus negative 2 minus negative 2. Do it to both sides. Double negative makes positive. We know that. Slash and dash. X equals 24 plus 2 is 26. Okay, so we have a x value of 26. Oh, geez, I hope that's right. I guess that's why we're going to check it. And then plus 7 minus 7 minus 7. All right, so if this minus 20 and minus 7 is confusing, type it in a calculator. Just know that everything you're doing, you're combining these things. Combining always means adding. So we're doing that to 0. Y value will equal negative 27. So negative 20 plus negative 7 is negative 27. So you should have 26, negative 27. Plug that back into your midpoint formula whenever you use your two endpoints, one which is up top and then the other which is down below, 26, negative 27. Whenever you solve the midpoint formula, you should get 12, negative 10. All right, we're given an endpoint and a midpoint. Let me go ahead and label the x and the y. We know that this is the answer. Notice I box that in every single time because I want to make sure I'm not using these numbers in anything other than next to an equal sign. All right, so plugging in the x, 11, plugging in the y, 14. We know that the x values are supposed to equal 10. We know that the y values are supposed to equal 14. All right, now we do the same thing. Times 2 on both sides, because we're balancing an equation. Times 2, times 2. I don't want half of that. I want to double that half and turn it into 1. That way I can solve the problem. Anything cut in half and then multiplied by 2 is going to turn into 1. X plus 11 equals 20. Anything that's cut in half and then you multiply that half by 2, half plus a half equals 1. Y plus 14 equals 28. So we know we're going to end up with another endpoint. Because we already said at the beginning we were given an endpoint in the mid, so that means we've got to find the other end. Solving a one-step equation, doing the opposite. We're still working backwards. 0, x equals 9. 20 plus negative 11, you can do 20 minus 11. I prefer to keep it addition, that way I don't have to overthink it. 20 plus negative 11 equals 9. We can label that x2 if you want. Doing the opposite, minus 14. I'm not showing you these steps because I want you to see the steps. I'm showing you the steps because this is exactly what you should be writing. And it equals 14. So what we're saying here is that we should have gotten another endpoint with x is 9 and y is 14. So the answer would be 9, 14. And whenever you plug your other endpoint into the midpoint formula to check, the answer should be 10, 14.